Hi, my name is Ana Guzman, and I'm one of your classmates in Applied Competencies this semester. Many of you know me from nutrition classes, but you probably don't know that diversity education is one of my passions. I've been doing this for 14 years and have developed presentations for high school students on white privilege and ableism, for college students on race and the Latino community, and Indigenous peoples in Latin America, and most recently here in Durham for adult and community presentations on cultural competence in providing domestic abuse and sexual assault services. So this is something that I care a lot about, and I hope that by the end of this presentation, in addition to meeting my formal objectives, that I will have convinced you that cultural competence is an important skill to attain in general and in diabetes care in particular. After listening to this presentation, you should be able to define cultural competence, list 3 reasons why cultural competency is important for RDs working in diabetes care, especially for CDEs, describe one type of regional variation in Latino food practices, and identify 3 sources of information to help improve your cultural competence. Many jobs require cultural competence. In fact, most jobs do. This is especially true for RDs working in diabetes, which disproportionately affects some racial and ethnic groups. Let's consider one of these jobs. A certified diabetes educator is a health professional with extensive experience in pre-diabetes, diabetes management, and prevention. A CDE must possess a qualifying degree, such as nursing, or be an RD. They must meet strict practice guidelines, including having a minimum number of total hours and a minimum number of recent hours. Then, they must pass an examination. Finally, the CDE must meet continuing education requirements. Now that we've considered one job, let's define cultural competence. What is cultural competence? Cultural competence is a set of congruent or coherent attitudes, behaviors, and policies. It includes understanding the language, thoughts, communication, actions, customs, beliefs, values, and institutions of ethnic, religious, or social groups. What does this mean in practice? It means that healthcare professionals must be able to ask questions, listen carefully, speak simply and respectfully, and involve patients in their own treatment plans. The Campina-Bacocci model of cultural competence includes 5 steps. The first of these is cultural awareness. This step begins with thinking about your assumptions. For example, you might ask yourself whether your assumptions make counseling more difficult or less effective. You might ask a patient a question such as, is there anything you would like me to know about your diabetes, if you are in this step? The second step, cultural knowledge, reflects the fact that competence requires a broad body of knowledge about values, worldviews, everyday practices, health beliefs, food habits, and many other factors, including the physical, biological, physiological, and psychological differences that might exist among different racial or ethnic groups. For example, if you're preparing for a session with a patient, you might ask yourself, what is the prevalence of diabetes in this ethnic group, and consult the literature on this. You might also wonder, to what extent does the biomedical model of diabetes conflict with this patient's beliefs, and also consult the research for knowledge and resources to help with this question. The third step is cultural skill, which is the ability to collect culturally relevant information from clients. It involves asking questions such as, what language do you speak? Would you prefer an interpreter when we chat? Do you avoid some foods when you are feeling ill? The fourth step is cultural encounter, which involves obtaining information and providing culturally appropriate responses. This might include asking questions and responding to the information you receive, But it also might include nonverbal information, such as letting the client determine their personal space comfort zone, or observing your client's use of eye contact and responding accordingly. You might ask questions like, do you use any home remedies when you feel sick? Do you like trying new foods? Or how do you prepare this dish, to obtain more information and respond appropriately. The final step is cultural desire, which reflects the active want to be involved in cross-cultural encounters and seeking greater competence. Luckily, there are many resources available to help you in this journey. Over time, you will realize which clients are more comfortable talking about work and which clients are more comfortable talking about family. You might realize that some clients have questions like, how does my diabetes affect the family? Now that we've defined the 5 steps to cultural competence, I need to convince you that you need cultural competence. Why do nutrition professionals need to achieve cultural competence? Well, I can give you at least 3 reasons. The first and most important is that it improves patient outcomes. The second is that it enhances assessment and intervention, which naturally also affects outcomes. And the third is the more self-focused reason, which is to meet standards of professional practice in diabetes care. Let's start with the first one, improving patient outcomes. Research indicates that culturally competent diabetes self-management education improves health outcomes. For example, one randomized controlled prospective study of Mexican Americans with type 2 diabetes evaluated an intervention that included bilingual staff, 6 months of support groups, and weekly lectures on blood glucose monitoring, nutrition, and other self-care topics. This program was culturally competent in terms of language, diet, inclusion of family, and cultural health beliefs. At the 6 and 12-month marks, these subjects who were involved in the culturally competent education had significantly lower levels of beta A1C and higher knowledge of diabetes than their controls. Another example is a study that found that cultural and language barriers are significant factors that lead to non-compliance with insulin regimens by Hispanic patients. Let's move on to the second, enhance assessment and intervention. The Academy Evidence Analysis Library Project on Health Disparities includes the following question. What elements of cross-cultural communication enhance the effectiveness of nutrition assessment or intervention? Their systematic review reveals that bilingual providers, persons from that community as community health workers, focus groups to help develop materials, and culturally appropriate instruction all improve nutrition assessment or intervention. Now, it's commonly known that dietetics has a diversity problem. According to the Academy, only 2.5% of RDs are African American, and only 1.7% of RDs. This means that you will be seeing patients who are likely going to be very different. Not all patients are going to be able to see providers who are from their cultural group. So your cultural competence can positively affect your patient's outcomes. The third reason is meeting the standards of professional practice in diabetes care. The following are included in the SOPPs for all levels of practice. That means generalists, specialists, and advanced practitioners for diabetes care. The practitioner utilizes validated tools to assess developmental, functional, and mental status, and cultural, ethnic, and lifestyle factors. The practitioner recognizes the influence that culture, health literacy, and numeracy, and socioeconomic status have on health and illness experiences. They are able to connect clients to resources and services within their specific ethnic and cultural community. They are able to search for additional resources to positively influence diabetes nutrition outcomes for the patient's specific ethnic or cultural community. That is, you have a Latino patient who only speaks Spanish, you actively seek out resources to help them understand their condition in Spanish. And the practitioner applies knowledge and principles of disease prevention and behavior change appropriate for culturally diverse populations. So the standards of professional practice for diabetes across the board mean that you have to provide culturally competent care. There's really no excuse for not being able to deliver this bare minimum of culturally competent care. Now that we've defined cultural competence and established that it's pretty important for us to know, I want to make sure that I leave you with some tidbits on application. And we're going to consider Latino and Latin American food practices. Of course, this is going to be a very brief overview. Entire presentations could be given on each detail, but we want to provide just a little bit of overview so that you can leave with some knowledge for Latinos and not just research and practice knowledge. As many of you know, Latinos are the largest ethnic minority in the U.S., but Latinos are diverse in terms of language, appearance, religion, food traditions, and many, many other things. Although most Latinos speak Spanish, there are some regional differences in Spanish dialects, and not everyone speaks Spanish. This is true in Latin America, where Brazilians speak Portuguese and Belizeans speak English or Creole. And there are many indigenous languages that survive in Latin America as well. In addition, in the U.S., people start to lose their Spanish. Second, third generation Latinos may not necessarily speak Spanish, even though they have the cultural traditions of their families. In addition, you may encounter people from Latin America who do not speak Spanish because they are from one of these other groups, indigenous groups or non-Spanish speaking groups. So just to give an example of the kind of linguistic variety that exists just within Spanish, consider the example rice and beans, which has many different names, and of course, the recipes differ also. But it has many different names depending on where you are in Latin America. So some of these names are casamiento, gallo pinto, Creole rice and beans, arroz y habichuelas, la bandera, or moros y cristianos. Mexican American food practices vary by region. Central, South, and Pacific are three ways to divide up their food traditions. Mexican food is widely known for its use of chilies. There are many different types, many different flavors, smoked, stewed, dried, used in many different types of foods. And part of the reason that there's such variety is that the chili was first domesticated in Mexico. Another thing to keep in mind is that there's regional variation in whether Mexicans and Mexican Americans prefer corn or flour tortillas. Generally, people from northern Mexico prefer flour tortillas, and people from central and southern Mexico prefer corn tortillas. Moving to Central American food practices, there are national variations. Each country has its own traditions, and of course regional variations within each country. So here I've listed two examples. The first is one of my favorite soups. It's called caquic. It's a Guatemalan Mayan dish. The word caquic means red broth, and as you can see from that photo, there is a red broth. It's a turkey soup that is served with corn tamales on the side, and traditionally the tamal is the spoon. You see a spoon in this photo, but traditionally you're eating things off of the tamal. And so this is an example of an indigenous food within a Latin American country. On the right side, I included an example of a non-Spanish speaking country, Belize, and a snack food called garnaches. which are tortillas that can be either corn or wheat that have refried beans and cabbage and tomatoes, and sometimes some other toppings. They're very popular. You find them in all over the cities. And again, this is a variation on a food that's very common throughout Latin America. Tortillas with beans and tostadas are common in many countries. In the Caribbean, there are various influences. Two that I wanted to highlight are the indigenous and the African origins of many foods that are originally from the Caribbean in Latin America, but have spread throughout the region and are very commonly well known in the US as well. Indigenous foods include cassava and cassava bread, corn, cashew, which the photo that I've included, those are cashew apples. Many people don't realize that the cashew nuts that we sneak on are actually from a fruit. It's called the cashew. Cashew has many different names depending on where you are. In English, it's commonly called cashew apple. And then on the right side, I've included two variations of plantains, which are of African origin, along with okra and coconuts. Plantains are loved and common throughout Latin America, and the two versions that you see here, they're eaten green, which are unripe, as tostones, which are very popular in Cuba and of course then in Miami. And then on the right part of that plate, you see ripe plantains, which have been fried also, which are called maduros, or I just grew up knowing them as plátanos. But the ripe plantains are commonly eaten throughout Latin America. You also find plantain chips and snacks, and they can be eaten at all stages, from very green to completely black plantains. Now, because there's no possible way that I can cover everything about Latinos, let alone every other possible group, I wanted to make sure that I included some resources. First of all, the Evidence Analysis Library Health Disparities Project has links to the studies that are included, including the studies that were rejected, that were not included in their analysis. Additionally, all of these projects are updated periodically, and so you can go there to check for initial citations or check for updates. Of course, the cultural competence piece is not the only part of health disparities, because we know that health disparities are a serious problem in many communities, and so it's part of a larger project. The next resource that I want to point you towards is called Cultural Food Practices. It's available from the Academy. It's available for a discount if you're a member. It has a CD-ROM in the back, if anyone still has CD drives, that contains patient handouts. Unfortunately, my computer no longer reads CD-ROMs, but they include it. It's written by RDs, and it's specifically focused on diabetes management. And it provides not only all of these regions that I covered within Latin America, but differences within Asia, American Indians, including specific tribes, and other groups, of course. It's a beautiful cover and a very informative book, and a very good starting place if you are interested in learning more about food practices around the world. The next resource I want to point you towards are the Academy member interest groups. Now, I've listed the groups here, but the important thing to keep in mind is that these groups are not just affinity groups for Asian Indians, for Chinese Americans. They also sponsor and co-sponsor information sessions, including presentations at FENCI, and so they can also serve as resources, point you to research, to community organizations, because they're closer to those communities than you might be. So that's one place where you can reach out and meet new people and also find resources. And then the final place that I want to point you to, since we're talking about Latinos, is the American Diabetes Association professional website. has links. There are 29 topics in diabetes care, and they're provided in both English and Spanish, and so you can provide detailed, professionally developed materials specific to diabetes in Spanish if your clients need Spanish materials, or in English if they prefer English. So with that, thank you very much for listening to this presentation. Muchas gracias. Obrigada.